Tonight's breakdown dives into the twist that changed everything, Caroline blowing the lid off Hayley's lethal scheme and dragging Bill back from the brink. We're unpacking the poison trail hidden in wellness files, the staged alarm that funneled Bill toward a perfect accident, and the ripple effects tearing through Danny, Andre, Vanessa, Joey, Nicole, Martin, and even the quiet outlier Smitty. Was Hayley a mastermind or a weapon in someone else's hand? Who profits if Bill falls, and how far will the shadow architect go to strike again? Stay to the end for our theory map, the money path no one's watching, and the one safeguard that could still fail. If you love high-stakes power plays, moral gray zones, and razor-edge investigations, hit like, subscribe, and ring the bell, because this is where we separate damage control from hidden design. Caroline stepped into the moment like someone who had walked through fire and returned with her hands still dusted in ash, not to brag about a conquest but to drown every false skin that had been stretched over a filthy truth, and as the strands of evidence lined up in a straight rank on the cold table, the air itself seemed to thicken until each breath felt suspect. The story was not merely about stopping a woman from quietly pushing a man toward the side's blade, but about a grinding clash between ambition and conscience, between debts of the past and blood-soaked rewards promised by the future. Caroline exposed traces of poison disguised as health vitamins, the route by which those harmless-looking capsules were folded into a supplement schedule after long workdays, as well as delivery logs smudged to blur the sender's name yet uncannily synchronized with Hayley's movements in the very days Bill's strength faltered. She rebuilt the timeline from entry badges, mobile data, grainy corridor cameras in the private wing, and the messy notes in Bill's personal planner, where manipulated blank windows forced him to change routes, funneling him onto dim stretches of road with unusual traffic signals. The loose pieces, set in their rightful places, lifted their chins and pointed at a will to kill calculated to the decimal, and that was the instant Bill's heart seemed to break, less because death had been yanked from his neck at the last second, more because betrayal stood before him wearing a familiar face. Hayley did not scream, did not shatter all at once, but the desperate thresh of her denial surged like a tide against rock, peeling back seaweed layers of motive and the ancient fears that had warped every choice. And in the eye of that storm, Caroline held ground like a lock wedged in a gate, knowing that saving a man's life in that flicker of time was only the first breakwater, because behind Hayley loomed larger, colder silhouettes, hands that never left fingerprints. The exposure froze the room, but its heat radiated outward, scorching relationships already abraded by suspicion and ambition. Danny felt the aftershock first, not through ears and eyes but through the survival instinct of someone who had gone too far into murky bargains where the border between protecting the people you care about and protecting yourself no longer exists. Danny understood that if Hayley's scheme was only the tip, the submerged mass had long threaded itself through side contracts, off-books funds, and promises traded in windowless rooms. She quietly re-audited her connections, stared at lists of deleted calls and odd expenditures on sub-accounts, and wondered if her own eagerness to keep the high ground over Vanessa and Joey had lured her into a contamination zone where everything might be bait. Andre masked his agitation with outward restraint, while inside pride and the dread of losing position boiled. He saw himself standing before a chessboard rigged by antique names in the dark, each piece wearing an invisible bridle. He knew Caroline would never move without favorable odds, and that troubled him as much as it impressed him, because the next blast could bend the arc of power he had been carefully hoarding. His gaze traveled across the ecosystem of money and influence, where certain forces required Bill's collapse to redraw the dividend map, and if Hayley was merely the borrowed executioner's hand, then who placed the blade in her palm? Vanessa brushed the story like someone on the rim, yet sensed a design trying to shove her into the center. She knew the storms inside Bill, knew how a man who had trusted the wrong person can lock his world behind chaos, and precisely at that cliff's edge the invitations to betray slip in like thieves. She recognized that Caroline had just saved a life, but had also dragged Vanessa into a new cyclone of doubt, because anyone standing too close to Bill now could be parsed as potentially complicit. She replayed every polished toast with Hayley at glittering events, every sidelong glance, and shivered at the realization that this picture seemed sketched long ago, waiting only for one final stroke to push Bill off the board. Joey read the board with the cool eyes of a man who doesn't believe in coincidence. He could practically taste the metallic chill of power reallocating in the air. He did not weep or quake, he diagrammed flows and marked possible inlets. But his very coldness posed a vicious question, because if he could see a path for himself, then those in the dark could also see him. Nicole faced it with the reflex to preserve whatever could still be steadied, trying to hold one last plank of order for the family before a steady rain turned the foundation into slurry. She had believed in negotiations and in the utility of political compromise, but when she heard about vitamins laced with a slow toxin, she understood that some thresholds cannot be bargained across. She wondered whether a soft season in Bill's life had been recorded and set as the wedge for his assassination, or whether she was merely hunting ideals to dull the pain of a simpler reality. Someone within the inner ring wanted him erased. Martin was jammed in the vice where ethics and strategy gnaw each other raw. He understood that a failed murder does not end in silence, it begins with purges, sealed trades to scrub evidence, and whispered threats to smother the germ of resistance. He sought his own name penciled in the margins of too many tales, and that made him yearn to step into the light to clean house, even as he feared a single wrong step would turn him into the next sacrificial goat. Smitty caught the storm scent first from the back door, where anonymous messages were usually tossed like trash but sometimes hid the cipher to a plan. He fished out a string of symbols encoding traffic anomalies along the route Bill was supposed to take on the accident night, paired with a maker's mark matching a small contractor known for camera systems. One tiny detail at a time fused into the conclusion that, absent Caroline's counterstrike, a staged scene was already laid, and what the world would have tomorrow was a sterile headline about a body losing to bad luck. Bill went mute before his own supplement schedule, where tidy lines sat beside the memory of his own trusting smile in the mirror. He saw the engineered fatigue he had explained away as stress, the way his life's direction had been bent with a few small capsules. A strange fear slipped over him, not of death, but of the discovery that sensations he thought were uniquely his could be manipulated by invisible means. From the second Caroline yanked him off the ledge, he no longer lived in gray. He had to choose, and the choosing would devour old alliances. But which road when each was mined, and could he stay lucid enough to tell the backstabber from the rescuer who might be saving him not to shine, but to tilt a listing world back toward balance? Hayley met failure with a punishing blend of pride and panic. She did not picture prison, she pictured the person who had abandoned her mid-bridge. A plan of this scope could not rest on her hands alone. Someone had engineered the clever joints, someone had promised the cleanup once the final bell rang. Why, then, did they leave her naked when the curtain fell? Or was she designed as a decoy all along, a lure hurled into the blaze so the prophets behind her could slink quietly back to channels she would never touch? Faces flickered through her mind, business cards, clinking glasses in chilled rooms, late appointments fat with talk of shifting the order of things with a single signature. She knew Bill's soft spots, knew what psychological levers isolated him fastest, but she had not calculated the variable named Caroline, a woman not only clear-eyed but wired into a lattice willing to bite down on every weak knot. Even as her scaffolding collapsed, Hayley clung to an old faith that the ones behind her would not let her drop too far, because if she surfaced and started to speak, more than one person would drown. Caroline felt no lift in this first victory. She knew she had pressed a palm to a sheet of ice, lifted a fraction and cracks would veer outward, exposing the black water beneath. She audited her chain of custody, bleached trails that might trace back to her, and above all took the measure of Bill's mind, because a victim hurled into a storm becomes soft bait for unruly revenge. She surveyed the secondary rings where Danny, Andre, Vanessa, Joey, Nicole, Martin, and Smitty each exerted private gravity, and understood that today's block would spawn a cascade of reactions. Who would harvest the most from the chaos? Who would burn what must burn to stay hidden? Who would toss another name into the furnace to buy themselves a few months of calm? Quietly she built a two-tier plan, the lawful layer to make Hayley step through the door of accountability, and the shadow layer to send oblique signals and watch which deeper net trembled. Danny saw the winter in Caroline's gaze and recognized that this game had outgrown personal rivalries. She faced a brutal choice: sacrifice a small square, expose a couple of gray transactions to scatter attention, or hold her breath and bet that Caroline's beam would stay on Hayley. Each option gnawed at the remnant of honor she still claimed, an honor already eroded by too many times she chose power over truth. Andre refused passivity. He sounded out Smitty to gauge how deep the assault had cut into the private security lattice around Bill. Learning that someone had retuned traffic signals on the planned route chilled him. This was no single operator but a crew that knew how to launder its hands. He stood at a fork: reinforce a flank with Caroline by yielding a hard truth, or clutch his secrets and wait the storm out. Either path carried a price, and he knew the dark would send any pivot he made. Vanessa tethered herself to one principle: fear would not deform her reason. She sat with herself, counted what she could still hold, and asked whether those who smiled at launches were waiting for her to slip so they could drag both her and Bill under. She wanted to believe Caroline acted for justice, but she knew this world too well to forget that every justice has a budget and a timetable. Nicole tried to keep rhythm for the family, shrink the leaks, dial older sources for advice that mixed sincerity and self-interest, each voice pretending to care while probing whether their own names might appear on the question list. She chose not to retreat. She held position, raised firewalls, and accepted that some ties must snap to save the rest. Martin took pressure from two directions, a coercive request reeking of menace on one side, a polished invitation to stand together from a faction claiming to purify on the other. He knew there is no pure. He pictured files that, if released, would incinerate bridges, and if buried, would torch his exit route. Smitty stayed with the thread he had, digging into the camera subcontractor, following a contract that passed through 3 intermediaries to a shell company that awakened only 4 urgent infrastructure fixes. He tied it to a burst of anonymous texts from a disposable handset and concluded that an internal link had been bought, or worse, had volunteered. Reporting back to Caroline, they recognized this opened a grove of snares. The deeper they walked, the greater the chance they would brush against the name no one dared speak. In the center of the vortex, Bill had to decide. He could collapse beneath betrayal and wall himself up in rage, or he could straighten his spine and convert survival into disciplined war. But all wars need allies, and here the question grew lethal: how far could he trust Caroline, who had saved him and in doing so forced his eyes open to things that cannot be unseen? Would he keep Vanessa inside the circle when any tender glance of hers could be decoded as weakness for enemies to weaponize? Would he crush Hayley by the hardest road, or revise the strategy and turn her into a portal leading upward to someone larger? Could he stomach colluding with one ugliness to expose a worse one? At the map's far edge, darker questions thickened. Who supplied a formula subtle enough to dodge routine medical thresholds? Who slipped a hand into traffic control without tripping internal alarms? Who charted Bill's habits so precisely they could time the instant his focus would blur? And why choose this moment, when Caroline had just finished scouring a few old dumps in her sphere? If not random, was someone testing her, forcing her to reveal her wiring so the next strike could carve straight through it? Hayley felt the circle empty as arms that once soothed withdrew. She stood in a rain of rumors and watched the shadows of bosses in her head, some who preferred silence, some who wrote letters as short and sharp as knives. She accepted the brutal theorem: if she became a liability, she would be erased more cleanly than she had planned to erase Bill. But if she proved her value, if she could absorb blame, if she could play the madwoman who draws all fire, perhaps she'd live, at least for a while. Caroline read that calculation in Hayley's eyes and knew the hostage game of emotions was coming. To spring that trap, she needed a seam, and seams often come from the greed of a low-level link, from a sloppily filed invoice, from one miscovered transfer. She agreed to step deeper, aware that each yard would sand down her own borders. Perhaps at that black edge, people meet their truer selves, forced to answer what they are fighting for: a man who barely escaped death, a fleeting chance to rebalance, or the need to prove that the dark has its laws and she is the one who writes them. Inner ramparts cracked in different ways. Danny faced her double, the version that hid a blade in her sleeve and called it strategy. Andre stared into the vacancy at the top and saw an empire that could fall if he placed one brick wrong. Vanessa held on to decency as an anchor in rough sea, but she knew any grip too long on an anchor can pull you under. Joey counted doors and tried not to let appetite write his reason, because any hand clever enough to stage a near-perfect murder without a scent would be clever enough to wipe him if he stepped out of rhythm. Nicole named the things no one wants to name and prepared for a cleansing in which no one is wholly innocent. Martin set his pen on a blank page and lifted it again and again, knowing one signature might save him today and kill him tomorrow. Smitty tugged more threads and accepted the risk of getting reeled into the snare. Failing to go to the end would only mean more bodies later. And Bill, eye of the storm, rose in silence, admitting the bitter truth that a life's work can be smashed by a single mislaid trust, while recognizing that a life snatched back is not an invitation to hide but to recalculate everything. When night fell again, phones stopped vibrating, corridors emptied, and everyone returned to their own shadows. The silence was not peace but the measure in which the storm turns. Will those behind Hayley let Caroline walk with a flashlight into their tunnel? Or are they ready to counter by sinking a blade into the ribs of the weakest link, forcing the pack to chew itself? Will Danny trade one secret for a breath and set Andre ablaze with it? Will Vanessa keep clean hands when the only shield left may be built from dirty tools? Will Joey resist the velvet whisper from the dark? Will Nicole hold as the knives slip toward the family's name? Will Martin escape the altar with one cunning move, or be crushed by his hesitation? Will Smitty reach the lead link before he himself vanishes? Above all, can Bill be ruthless enough with his former self to be reborn into something that survives this forest? No answer yet, only the ozone scent that warns of another lightning stroke. Caroline pulled the map taut in her mind and chose quiet as armor, knowing the road ahead leaves no room for softness. She had saved a life, but to keep it safe from wolves she would have to negotiate with parts of herself she always wanted to deny. And perhaps, in exposing a plot to kill, she was forced to face the more terrible premise that sometimes, to protect a life, one must agree to forfeit a piece of the soul, and once that piece is signed over to the night, is there any path left to take it back whole? Before dawn, the building held its breath. A hairline payment flickered through a charity ledger, echoing the exact minute a traffic grid blinked and a pill schedule shifted. Caroline marked it with a single stroke, recognizing bait disguised as perfection. Bill faced the window's ghost and measured whether to weld the past shut or carve forward with its shards. Hayley, quarantined in sterile light, sorted names into tinder and currency, calculating how deep she'd be dropped before being reeled up for dirtier work. Danny hovered over an unsent file that could buy air or paint a target. Andre weighed a call that might realign the board or nominate his throat. Vanessa adjusted her guardrails, knowing mercy without armor is carrion. Joey unfolded an offer that looked like a ladder and smelled like a leash. Nicole drafted a list of necessary losses. Martin erased every arrow he drew. When the first light scraped the curtain, Caroline's clock stalled one beat and lurched on, and in that skipped second the game chose its next victim.